70 years ago, after 6 years of bloody fighting, Nazi Germany finally surrendered to the Allied forces.
The people of Britain knew how to celebrate with the music of the big band.
This was the sound that saw us Brits through the Blitz. It was the country's darkest hour. It was the music that kept our spirits up.
Blackpool was at the heart of the nation's war effort. Bombers were built here, troops were trained here, and the beaches and the ballrooms offered a respite from the horrors of war. Even Hitler had his eye on the nation's favourite holiday resort. It's said that Blackpool escaped being bombed by the Luftwaffe because the Führer planned to turn it into his personal playground after his proposed invasion.
Blue skies smiling at me, nothing but blue.
Where Hitler failed, another force had been successful. It came from America, and it was the sound of music. Hitler thought it was degenerate, but we just loved it. This fantastic invention was the big band. Britain fell in love with the big band in the 1920s, and that love affair continued into the 1950s and beyond.
In this film, we're going to bring that amazing world of big band in wartime Blackpool back to life. Taking over the historic Empress Ballroom, Jules and his orchestra are going to perform some of the greatest hits of the age.
I'll be telling the story of some of the musical greats, the amazing artists who led the big band phenomenon from here and across in America. And Len and Lucy will be looking at how the sound of the big band weaved its way into the fabric of people's lives, how the music kept in sync with the massive social changes Britain was experiencing, and how we dressed to impress and danced our way through the horrors of war.
Together we want to show that for all the planes, guns and battleships of the Second World War, one of Britain's greatest weapons for boosting morale was the epic, brassy sound of the big band.
What is a big band? What are those amazing elements? What is its configuration? It is at the centre. There are the drums of Mr. Gilson Lavis. We have the bass of Mr. Dave Swift.
When I discovered big band music, it was one of the most exciting things I've ever heard.
We have the swinging organ of Mr. Christopher Holland. Pushing and gushing away. And the blue guitar of Mr. Mark Flanagan. Let's introduce the 5 saxophones that make this beautiful sound. Trombones. We join on top of that the trumpets, 3 of them. Oh, yeah.
To be in a room where there's 17 people swinging away is unlike anything.
Singing with a big band behind you is something that you have to experience to understand it.
It's like a punch in the face, it's incredible.
To really tell the story of the big band, you have to rewind to 20 years before the war. Just where did big band music begin in Britain?
As the country recovered from the trauma of the First World War, life had never seemed sweeter, at least for the well-off. Cocktail bars and jazz joints and nightclubs flourished, offering the bright young things every opportunity to dance the night away to a new kind of music.
It was syncopated. British big bands came to dominate our popular music, creating a melodic, exuberant sound influenced by jazz from America.
This was a style of music that emerged in the early 1900s as the traditional songs that had arrived in America with the African slaves morphed into blues, jazz, and ragtime. It was the perfect soundtrack to the 1920s. But to some figures in authority, this radically new sound was debauched, even dangerous.
I guess in the 20s, everything was shocking. So when people were doing the Charleston, there were certain parts of society that thought that was disgusting and perverted. So, you know, when new music comes along, there's always going to be an echelon of society that thinks that that's not good, that's not right.
The American big band leaders of the 20s have largely been forgotten. But the young musicians who played in their bands like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong and Count Basie went on to shape the big band and become world icons. People know those names. Even if they're not familiar with their music, they're familiar with their names. The earlier ones are now kind of lost more to the general public. But there's one like called Benny Moten, maybe a lot of people don't know about, but he was pretty fantastic. Benny Moten's early innovative arrangements came to define what a big band sounded like.
Benny Moten, for me, is one of the great unsung heroes because he gave the ammunition that went in the guns, the musical guns, and people like that aren't around now. So he should be in the history books right next to all these guys that we're talking about.
He died, and Count Basie took over his band, and that's what became the Count Basie band.
Basie's band was very much thought of as a good time band. It had this relentless kind of chug to the beat, and you hear it and you're on your feet and you're smiling, you're tapping. It was the epitome of happy music.
Count Basie is a person that I've studied a lot because I just really liked a lot of the things about him. I didn't want to sound like him, I wanted to learn about what he was doing. And sometimes I do copy what he does, which is very minimal. You realise doing all of this isn't necessarily the best thing to do. Sometimes just doing... and a big gap, and then huge horns doing this and a big gap was great. You realise, you listen to the music and it suddenly went, hey, there's a space here. Mr. Robert's Roost by Count Basie. The great thing about this, it illustrates better than any other piece that he did the thing of having the big gaps.
During rehearsals, Jules convinced me to have a go at this one. So from now on, I shall be known as Count Lucy. But the heady excitement of the 1920s couldn't last forever. There were dark clouds on the horizon. By the end of the decade, the world would be in the grip of the worst depression of the century.
What that meant, of course, was very high unemployment and underemployment, people on very low wages. There was a great deal of poverty and a great deal of sort of despair. On the other hand, the other side of the coin was particularly young people who had been through so much and in many ways had lost 4 years of their youth, wanted to enjoy themselves, wanted to have some fun.
In the early part of the 30s, the soundtrack to those good times was Boogie Woogie.
At the time, it was often referred to as fast blues, but whatever you call it, Boogie Woogie was the father of rock and roll. All right then. I love to have a boogie. I'm gonna play something by one of the people that was the Boogie Woogie king and the inventors of boogie. This is written in the 1930s by Albert Ammons, Big Joe Turner. One of the people I really loved was Albert Ammons, and Albert Ammons and Pete Johnson were two of my favourite pianists, and they were just amazing pianists, and they really invented a lot of stuff and are very much forgotten. In the 30s, the craze for dancehalls was gripping the nation, and the music followed the trend. The rhythm that became dominant was the one that everybody wanted to dance to. That rhythm was swing.
Swing music really is all about dancing. It was music to dance to.
One of the kings of swing was this man, the great Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington was very popular in Britain, and he led a band of incredible soloists who always sounded cohesive, never competitive. I mean, Count Basie always said about Duke Ellington he was the greatest of all time, and I think Duke Ellington, in many ways, he was such an extraordinary composer. He worked with a man called Billy Strayhorn that did the arrangements for him.
With Ellington, you know who it is instantly, and that's because of his piano style, his composition style, and also the arranging style of a genius like Billy Strayhorn.
Thanks very much. That was Midriff, one of Billy Strayhorn's compositions, and now the Afrobosa. The Afrobosa is a kind of a gut bucket bolero. We start it now in a rather primitive rhythm, executed in a rather pre-primitive manner through the hands of Sam Woodyard.
If you read about what Duke Ellington's views on music in general are, it's kind of so gentle and welcoming to all music that he's a great guru, I think, not only for a big band person, but anybody that's interested in music.
You create something interesting, and you find an audience that's sensitive, then you have accomplished a great deal, and you make a big profit in joy.
One of the most popular swing artists of the 1930s was clarinetist Benny Goodman. This song, Rollin', was a huge hit, written by the extraordinary woman and big band composer and arranger, Mary Lou Williams.
And of course that was before rock and roll. Swing was our rock and roll at that time. We didn't know what rock and roll was.
Benny Goodman's big band became known as the training ground for many major names in music, not least Gene Krupa. His extraordinary drumming was the stuff of legend and made him a national celebrity. Certain people like, Gene Krupa would do the drum solos, and the different big bands had their own great drummers, and there would be a spot where they'd do the solo and everybody would stand back, so we do that too. Because we got Gilson, and he's the greatest. Britain fell in love with the American big band and then went on to create its own unique sound.
All the American big bands were obviously popular in the UK thanks to radio, but there were British dance bands who were very much copying the American bands, but they did have, by default really, because they were made up of British guys, they did have their own sound.
During the 1930s, most British jazz musicians made their living in dance bands, and this coincided with the public's growing appetite for music, both on record and on the radio.
Well, that concludes the programme of dance music played to you by the BBC Dance Orchestra, directed by Henry Hall. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye, and here's to the next time.
Well, of course, not only was the big band performing live, but there were gramophone records and there were broadcasts, and there were outside broadcasts. I mean, the BBC would send out a team to broadcast performances either in big ballrooms or in nightclubs.
All these big band leaders had their own radio slots every week, and that's how audiences got familiar with them and the material.
Once you had the big band, it was a big sound, but then people wanted songs as well, and the vocalists came along. Although they were kind of secondary to the band, it wasn't like now, we have such and such a singer and the band behind them. You'd have a big band and they'd have a guest vocalist.
One notable British band leader was Ray Noble, who wrote lyrics and music for some of the best-known songs of the era, notably for Al Bowley, a popular jazz crooner.
Good night, sweetheart, all my dreams are of you. Good night, sweetheart, I'll be watching all you.
Britain's ambassador of song, the great British crooner, they called him. And he came from South Africa. He had a Greek father and a Lebanese mother. The great British crooner. But he had a unique style.
And, you know, he was very good looking, and he had, a croon means to whisper, and it is very, I mean, it comes from the word to whisper, and it is very seductive, and the whole idea about crooning is it gives the impression it's being directed at you and only you.
I see your face in every flower, your eyes in stars above. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love.
It brings back exactly the period. It was a great voice.
Without a love of my own.
A new generation of extraordinary singers were beginning to make their mark. Vocalists have been a component of the big bands from the beginning, but they were used sparingly and weren't the stars of the show. By the 30s, this had all changed with the arrival of some of the 20th century's most legendary singers.
It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. Boo-ah, 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 boo-ah. It don't mean a thing, all you gotta do is swing.
Ella Fitzgerald was one of the great stars who became bigger than the bands she was in.
She entered a talent competition at the Apollo Theatre. She went along actually as a dancer, but she was standing in the wings ready to go on and got nerves and wouldn't go on and dance. So someone said, look, you've got to do something. So she went on and sang, and the prize was that she got to sing with the big band that was in situation there. She eventually joined Chick Webb's band. She was like 16, 17 years old, and then eventually ended up leading the band when Chick Webb left. So she became a band leader really by default. But she grew up, you know, listening to big band musicians and learning about phrases from all those musicians, as so many singers of that period did.
In Britain's dance halls, the late 30s were a golden period. To ordinary people, this seemed like the first proper fun they'd had after the Great War and the Great Depression. But it wasn't to last long.
It is only after many vain attempts to remain at peace that we have been at last forced to go to war.
When war broke out on the 3rd of September 1939, all places of public amusement were compulsorily closed. But the entertainment blackout didn't last long. The government reversed its decision when they realised that cinemas and theatres and ballrooms were essential for raising morale. When the nation's dance halls reopened, it was the sound of the big band that lured in the crowds.
Soon after war was declared, Blackpool swung into action, training troops by day and entertaining them at night. For a while, so many London-based musicians moved to Blackpool that there was even an accommodation crisis. The journey north was made doubly attractive by the opportunity of regular work without the terror of the bombs that were falling in London.
The town changed with the war. There was a huge flood of young men coming into Blackpool because it was the RAF's largest recruitment and training area. In the ballrooms, the occasional big band member could be seen performing in his service uniform.
Blackpool played a considerable part in the war efforts. There was munitions work, aircraft construction, 750,000 RAF trainees had their initial training in Blackpool through the war. It was a logical place to be. Lots and lots of wide open spaces, lots and lots of large indoor spaces, and lots of accommodation in town. That made a huge difference because at any time there might be tens of thousands of people in town undergoing training, all of whom wanted to go out in Blackpool at night and enjoy themselves. Going to the cinema, going to the theatre, going to Blackpool's fantastic ballrooms. Blackpool provided a haven from the war.
Some of the big names in Britain's big band scene stayed in London despite the bombing. Band leader Ken Snakehips Johnson died dramatically while performing during the Blitz right here in the Café de Paris. But even among the death and destruction here, one survivor retained his sense of humour. After being pulled from the rubble and carried out on a stretcher, shouted to the crowd, "Hey, at least I didn't have to pay for my dinner."
Ken Snakehips Johnson. Not a bad name, is it? The He had a good band, all West Indian band it was. He was really a dancer.
He was just gyrating his hips in a slithery kind of amazing way that not a lot of people could emulate.
And he was very lithe, and I suppose in a sense he was the Elvis Presley of his day, and that's how he got his nickname, Snake Hips Johnson. He was performing at the Café de Paris. It was supposed to be the safest place in London as a nightclub because it was very deep underground. But of course, a bomb hit it, and very few places are safe from a direct hit. In fact, the bomb went straight through the floor and into the restaurant, and Snake Hips Johnson was killed, which broke a lot of hearts.
In the confusion of war for a while, it was thought that #1 crooner Al Bowley had died in the same bomb attack as dear old Snake Hips Johnson.
Well, everybody thought that. And the reason they thought that was because in amongst all the wreckage, they found his band parts in a little folder. Al Bowley. All burnt round the edges and everything. But they said, oh, well, he must have been there, you see. Well, he wasn't there. He wasn't there that particular night.
But as it turned out, Al Bowley's lucky escape was only temporary. He met his end just a few weeks later in another air raid.
Well, he went to bed one night because his girlfriend said, you must go to the shelter, which he never would.
He thought he was so lucky not to have escaped the Café de Paris one. He thought, well, that's it, I'm fine now. You know, I've missed my air raid, so that's it. And sadly, he wasn't.
They found him sitting up in bed with a cowboy book in his hand, which he was reading, and the blast had killed him. People always say, everything happened to Bowley at just the wrong time. He just snuffed it when the star of all those sort of band shows was going to be the singer. And he never quite did that. He just snuffed it before he should have done.
Wartime in Britain, and particularly London, was of course a harrowing time for most people. For some children, though, the constant call to the air raid shelters became a nightly game of dare.
My sister and I were living just outside London, and we used to see the bombers, German bombers, going over every night. We could set our clocks. They were very, very precise in their timing, and we used to watch all the dogfights going on. It was, I suppose, a strange life, but we found it absolutely normal because that's the way it was, you know. We didn't ask any questions. We didn't quite know what war was all about, but it ruled our lives. That's very true. Yes, with air raid sirens, and, you know, jumping into the air raid shelter, especially with the V1s, and our timing was very good. We would know exactly when to jump. It became a game of chicken, you know. The engine would cut out and they got a few seconds to get to the shelter, you know. It became a game. So that was our experience of the war.
In London, the BBC would broadcast messages to the troops overseas from family members, often from children. But for one little girl, that one radio appearance would be the start of a lifelong career.
This show was done from the Criterion Theatre, which is an actually underground theatre in Piccadilly. And during the war, the BBC used to use this theatre as a studio because it was full of sandbags. It was like being in an air raid shelter. And we went along to do this. I was going to send my message to my Uncle Dudley. And during rehearsal, there was the most enormous air raid. And a lot of the kids had come up from the country and were a bit nervous. And I was sort of used to it, you know, as a London kid. And somebody said, would somebody like to come up and sing a song, say a piece of poetry, just to calm things down? Nobody volunteered, so I said, I will, you know. So I went up on the stage and they put a box in front of the microphone so I could reach it, and I sang. And they heard it in the control room and said, yeah, that's a good voice for radio. Would you like to sing your song as well as your message? I said, yeah. And of course there was a band there too. And just like in the movies, they all joined in with my song, which was Mighty Like a Rose.
Don't know what to call him, but he's mighty like a rose. Looking at his mammy with eyes so shiny blue.
And there was a huge reaction from the troops to that, and that was really the beginning of my big career as a child performer. I was about 8.
Petula would entertain the troops both on the radio and live at military bases throughout the UK. She was so popular that she became something of a mascot for the British Tommies.
When the postman brought little Petula Clark a pile of letters after her first broadcast, she was surprised. She's used to it now because she's become a regular star with a regular fan mail.
The war created a huge demand for music to entertain the troops and boosted the appeal of military bands.
#1 Balloon Centre, RAF, turn on a dance at their camp. Audience and orchestra is 100% Air Force. The band leader is Corporal George Beaumont, once well known to London's Prince of Wales theatre goers.
The squadronettes with the RAF band, and my God, they were good. They got them all together, formed a band, and they said, you're going over to France to entertain our boys who are doing the fighting over there. So they all got together and they did their basic training as ordinary airmen. And while they were doing that, France fell. So they had to stay in England, in which they spent their time rehearsing, getting the band right and everything, and they turned out possibly the best band that ever came out of the war, they did.
Another picture that speaks louder than words of Anglo-American solidarity. The arrival in Northern Ireland of the first contingent of the United States Army to stations in the United Kingdom.
The war had been raging for more than 2 years before Pearl Harbor brought America into the action and boatloads of GIs to Britain. There were suddenly a few 100,000 more troops to keep entertained, and some American big band stars came over to help.
In 1942, Glenn Miller was at the peak of his career as one of America's favourite band leaders. At 38, he was too old to enlist, but he was still determined to use his music to boost wartime morale. After pulling some strings, he won a commission, formed a forces band, and became a superstar of US Army entertainment.
He was a very patriotic man, and he wanted so much to come over and help out by boosting people's morale.
He transferred to London in 1944 to be closer to the fighting, but the city was a dangerous place.
When Glenn saw the conditions and the bombs falling and so on, he said, I want my guys out of here. They said, yeah, fine, we'll just... No, I mean now. So he pulled a bunch of strings. Next morning, trucks are there, they load him up off to Bedford, where he spent the rest of the war billeted up there. And that night, Sloane Square was hit by a bomb. And it killed like 70 people, I think, and took the corner off the building. That was where the band was staying. So he got them out just in time.
The band started touring military bases, performing around 800 concerts to over 1 million service personnel.
For the second time in a generation, the youth of America is marching off to war. But this time to new and livelier rhythms, a new style of bandsman like Captain Glenn Miller. This is the wartime tempo of a fighting but light-hearted nation.
Glenn Miller even performed at a training camp just outside Blackpool.
It was General Hap Arnold, I think, that said, Glenn, your music is next best thing to a letter from home. The first ever gold record, which was some PR guy's idea, he sold 1 million records of Chattanooga Choo Choo. We'll publicize this by having a gold record made. So that's where the gold record started. It was the first one ever.
I loved Glenn Miller. It was so musical. It was swing, but it was also romantic. And the way he wrote for the woodwinds. That immediately brings back memories of that time.
Tuxedo Junction, a lot of people will know by Glenn Miller, but originally it was done by Erskine Hawkins. And he just did this great version. I bought a 10-inch record and put it on and just started playing along to it and realised it was like kind of really bluesy. I hadn't realised that before, what a blues sort of thing it was. During World War II, female musicians were given new opportunities when the men were called up to fight. Ivy Benson and her all-girl orchestra topped the bill around the country.
All of them were girls. She did say at one time, she said, Ivy, I do get some rather doubtful men coming dressed as women, she said, but I won't have them. I said, whether she gave them a medical, I don't know. But she wanted to prove, Ivy, because she was a damn good musician herself, she wanted to prove that girls could play as good as blokes. And I think they did during the war.
Well, it didn't matter about quality in those days, but to me it mattered, and I think that was my incentive to try and break out on my own. I wanted it to be equal to a male band. I wanted it to sound the same.
It was very much a man's world, but Ivy Benson did well and compared very well with the other bands. She was good.
Ivy's signature tune was, they all seemed to have signature tunes in those days, and hers was Lady Be Good. She said, and that was advice to the girls in my band as much as anything else.
Sweet and lovely, lady be good, oh, lady be good to me.
She said we used to play a lot of the American basses, you know. She said, and I always worried about it because whenever we played an American bass, I always lost at least 2 musicians. these GIs used to sweet-talk them, and they thought, I think I'll go to America much easier than being in the back of a bus with Ivy and the girls.
The other great woman that we are sort of focusing on, or the music of, was Sister Rosetta Tharpe.
Didn't it rain, children? Rain, oh, yes. Didn't it? Yes, didn't it? You know it did, didn't it? Oh, yes, how it rained.
What's great about her is she had a foot in several musical camps. She was gospel, it was blues, it was rhythm and blues, and when you chuck all those things together, you end up with someone who has their own voice.
But this music, if you didn't put labels on it, I thought it was just rock and roll because it was so exciting.
I said 4 or 5 times. 4 or 5 times. Now he's my king. He makes me sing 4 or 5 times.
There's a period where she works with the Lucky Millinder Big Band.
Look down that lonesome road before you travel on.
Lucky Millinder, his intention was to lift people up because I think people had a hard time. You know, they roll into town on their bus, people come to the dance hall and they need someone to go, bosh, let's lift up. Whoa, we're alive, you know.
Look down that lonesome road before you travel on.
She was on stage one night singing Away, and there was a guy in the audience who was actually the program seller. He was selling programs, selling beer, selling peanuts, and he started singing along with her. And she was so impressed with this program seller, she said, look, come on stage and sing with me. And that program seller was Little Richard.
She not only influenced Little Richard, but her amazing guitar playing was to inspire Johnny Cash, Jimi Hendrix, and many others. You know, Johnny Cash says he used to hear Sister Rosetta Tharpe on the radio when he was growing up. We had a 78 in my house with Sister Rosetta Tharpe. I thought it was her playing the piano. It wasn't. It was her playing the guitar. I didn't know that. I later learned it was Sammy Price on the piano. But it was my mum's treasured 1940s 78 of Sister Rosetta Tharpe that inspired me to want to play Up Above My Head.
And it wasn't just on stage that women were now doing jobs that had once been for the boys. Millions joined up to do things from working the land to building tanks. They came from all over the country to Blackpool to join the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. An elite group of female pilots even took to the sky to deliver planes, Spitfires like this one, from the factories to RAF bases. The people who looked after the planes gave them nicknames, and I particularly approve of this one because it was called Lucy.
Straighten up and fly right. Straighten up and fly right. Straighten up and fly right. Cool down, Papa, don't you blow your top.
The effect of the Second World War on women depended, I think, very much on your age and your situation. If you were a mother and a housewife, if you had children under 14, you weren't required to do anything for the war effort. Younger women, I think, a lot of them had quite a lot of fun in the war, because a lot of them who had been expected to live at home until they married were able to leave home, either to go into the forces or to go onto the land, the Women's Land Army, or to go into war production factories, and they'd often live in hostels, you know, and then they'd meet RAF cadets and they'd meet soldiers, and it was a liberating time. They earned some money and they just had a much freer life than they'd had before the war.
When their work was done, women rushed to the dance hall.
It was an evening's haven from the horrors of war. The old-time dances that topped the bill, the waltz, the tango, the foxtrot, were nostalgic reminders of a pre-war age, but they were adapted now to the huge and irresistible sound of the big band.
People wanted to be together. They wanted to dance. They wanted to move about, anything to take their mind off the war. And the big bands came in with those marvellous sounds and everything. They came in and they did the same job as the old music halls did. But the difference was things had advanced to a certain degree because boys and girls wanted to touch each other. They wanted to dance together. You know, not sit in rows and that and just singing Daisy, Daisy. They wanted to be part of the show, very much so. The atmosphere of the halls was highly charged sexual feeling. You looked around and you looked for a partner, someone to dance with, and hopefully maybe something a bit more as well. It was like a mating place, really. You wanted to pick out a good girl or a good boy, or, you know, and that was it. That was the atmosphere. And when the band started that terrific music and you danced together, it was a magic time.
It became a ritual for girls to stand in a usual spot so that the men they danced with the previous night could find them again if they'd had a good time. So, Fred, what was it like to come into this ballroom in the 40s? What would you see? What would you hear?
I couldn't leave it alone. I had to get every chance I could.
And you won prizes, did you?
No. I think I won a torch once.
A torch?
Yes.
Well, that's a prize.
It's a bit of a dance, and I really, really enjoyed it.
Now, I was told that you met your wife at a ballroom dance.
I met her in the tower.
You met her in the tower?
Yes.
You met her here?
Yes.
In this room?
Yes. Over there, one of those pillars.
By what? By that pillar?
By that pillar over there.
You met your wife to be?
Yes.
So your first words to your future wife were, will you dance with me?
Can I have this dance, please?
Can I have this dance, please?
And she said yes, but I'd weighed her up well before that. I knew she could dance. I wasn't getting on that floor if she couldn't dance.
It's too romantic.
It really was wonderful, that. I'll never forget it.
But not everybody was in love with the dance floor. One angry lady even wrote into the Evening Gazette complaining that the atmosphere in Blackpool was rather like that of a huge party instead of a country at war. And she does have a point. If you flick through the Evening Gazette, there's a story about a boy missing in action. Then on the next page, what's on at the dance hall?
Music and dance were a crucial part of everyday life for so many people. When they feared a night at the dance hall could be their last, it's no surprising that they partied hard. A serviceman on a 48-hour pass would make the most of every minute.
Dropping of bombs did not stop people going out to dance, and I think when they lost themselves in the music and the dancing, and that's what you do, you actually live like there's no tomorrow. That's what it was during the war.
I mean, the war was, apart from being a dangerous time, it was also a gloomy time. You had the blackout, you had rationing. You know, you needed some sort of distraction. So, I mean, the blackout didn't help because, of course, a lot of dances were held in the evening, so you got more sort of afternoon and early evening dances because of that.
The latest dance is the blackout stroll, and here it is demonstrated by experts before the rank and file take it up. In a minute, you'll see the point. The main idea is to change partners during the blackout. Practically anything might happen.
Blimey, my wife! Oh.
Also included in a night's entertainment would be sequence dances such as the Pally Glide, the Blackout Stroll, Lambeth Walk, and believe it or not, under the spreading chestnut tree. It appears these dances were included in an evening's programme to allow the shy or those with two left feet to get a grip with the opposite sex.
It put me off, even though I was quite young, because I was very shy, and it put a lot of shy guys, it put off, you know, because they thought, oh dear, what do I do? What if no one wants to dance with me? It's all going to be terrible. Just like girls did, they didn't want to be wallflowers.
Underneath the spreading chestnut tree, I loved him and he loved me. There I used to sit up on his knee.
Beneath the spreading chestnut tree,
I said I love you, and there ain't no ifs or buts. He said I love you, and the blacksmith shouted,
chestnuts!
King George VI was very good at that at scout camps. He'd sing that, and when it came to nod, he'd obligingly tap his hair. So.
The Queen and Princess Margaret, watching the King out of one eye and the singing director out of the other, win our sympathy by getting some of the actions wrong. With the campers, we hope that they'll put in some practice at Balmoral and come again next year.
underneath the spreading chestnut tree, I loved him and he loved me. There I used to sit up on his knee.
Beneath the spreading chestnut tree,
There beneath the boughs we used to meet. All his kisses were so sweet. All the little birdies went tweet, tweet.
beneath the spreading chestnut tree. New dances in the tradition of the Lambeth Walk continue to reach the ballroom. The latest is an animated accompaniment to the Siegfried Line song. The washing hangs out on the line as the steel-helmeted dancers step it up.
Dancing was so important to the morale of the nation that the BBC began broadcasting lessons on the radio called Dancing Club.
It's time for 40 Minutes with the BBC Dancing Club.
Britain's most popular band leader, Victor Sylvester, encouraged thousands of beginners to take to the floor, slowly dictating the steps, followed by a helpful pause so listeners could write them down.
Hello there, everyone. We give you another hearty welcome to our dancing club. This evening, I'm going to begin by telling you how to do the natural turn in the waltz. Write these steps down as I call them out. Start with the feet together, then this is what you have to do. 1, forward, right foot.
And of course, things like Melody Maker, which had been started at the end of the 1920s, and even the Radio Times, did elaborate sort of diagrams showing people how to dance, you know, so then they could listen to the wireless and do these steps, and then they could take them onto the ballroom floor.
You'll find a diagram of this figure on page 19 of the Radio Times.
Woody Herman's Woodchopper's Ball was one of the biggest 1940s dance hall hits.
Woody Herman, who was one of the great jazz clarinetists as well as a big band leader, what I love about his bands is, you know, a band like Count Basie or Duke Ellington would play popular hits of the day, but Woody Herman's band, they were a bit more of a riot. There was loads of blues in there. So the early Woody Herman bands, for my money, are some of the greatest blues bands of all time.
This is a piece by Woody Herman entitled The Casbah Blues. Woody Herman led a very popular big band, and one of the pieces he did was kind of, it all goes weird and everything goes like this, and it's quite good. You need the dynamics. In fact, that's the whole point of a big band. You need the dynamics and different flavours and colours, and I think that Casbah Blues is the best example of something like that.
Britain might have been in the grip of severe rationing. But when it came to nights out at the dance hall, the women of Britain prided themselves on keeping up appearances.
For the menfolk, it was easy, as a uniform made them all look like David Niven.
You're as pretty as a picture. Has anyone ever told you before?
Clothes and beauty as well were very important. They kind of took on a heightened air of importance really during the war, as it was seen to keep women's morale high and also keep men's morale high as well. If they were returning to the home front or if they were still working on the home front, then it was just seen as something of national importance.
Women had to make do, obviously, with what they had, but I mean, I'm sure young girls were very inventive. I mean, they had some clothes, of course, from before the war, but they would like nice things like ribbons. People were trying to, sort of jazz up their clothes.
Well, why not get together with your friends and form a make-do and mend group?
With a little ingenuity and a large pair of scissors, you can turn hubby's hat into a hat for his sweet little wife.
You're as pretty as a picture, a beautiful exhibition of art. When I say you fairly take my breath away, just picture what you have done to my heart.
Women had to make the most of their utility dresses, bought with saved-up coupons. But some essentials were missing, particularly silk stockings. All the silk had gone off to be made into parachutes. So the more adventurous would stain their legs brown with tea, and for the seam up the back, they'd use a device like this. Yes, it is a screwdriver, a bicycle clip, and an eyebrow pencil.
Well, to recreate the appearance of stockings, women were known to dye their legs with tea or maybe with gravy, stain them. I mean, it's not that different from fake tanning today, really, when you think about it. And also, of course, drawing a line up the back of your leg with sort of eyeliner pencil, which must have actually been very, very difficult to do to keep it straight. It really must have been difficult, I think.
Well, let's put the device to the test. Well, that's reasonably straight, isn't it?
Cosmetics were in very short supply, so you did what you could. You melted your lipstick down.
If you couldn't afford lipstick because it had a very high tax put on it, then you could use beetroot juice to stain your lips, or you were encouraged to use boot polish for mascara.
Clothes rationing made it was difficult, and of course, if you needed working clothes and things, you couldn't spend your coupons on frivolities. But I'm sure that they made their best to look pretty.
Now, another big change that happened during the war was that trousers on women became much, much more prevalent, much more popular. Fashion magazines initially really didn't like this. They talked about slackers in slacks, saw it as a very unfeminine means of dress. But really, by the sort of second or third year of the war, there'd been a sort of turnaround, a real shift, and people were actually encouraging this as a way of women dressing.
When America entered the war at the end of 1941, the nation's dance floors were invaded by an army of GIs. They had two advantages over their British rivals. They were better paid and they were better dressed. They also had a couple of secret weapons to sweep a girl off her feet. They were chocolates and nylons.
Naturally, we were grateful for America's, shall we say, rather last-minute assistance in preventing the end of the free world. However, there were some resentments caused by these swashbuckling heroes with their chewing gum and casual manners copping off with our womenfolk. It was said they were overpaid, oversexed and over here. They said we were underpaid, undersexed and under Eisenhower. We shared many jokes like this and became great friends.
Derek, did you have a special dancing partner?
No, these were the twins, Madeleine and Mary.
You had a pair of twins?
The twins, yes. After about 12 months, one of them said to me, "This is the last time we're going out with you, Derek.
So I said, why, what's wrong? She said, well, we've met 2 Americans and we're going out with those instead. So that was the end of a lovely friendship after 12 months, yeah.
What was the attraction of these dastardly Americans?
Well, there's a lot more money, and they can get the girls nylon stockings, which are very important during the war.
Well, let me tell you, Derek, if they left you for a pair of stockings, they were just shallow.
Probably got fed up when they, after 12 months.
Oh.
Yeah.
Americans, GIs, I think, were very attractive to English women, partly because they had money and were generous and would splash it around. A lot of them were very young.
And they used to, you know, slip the odd pair of nylons, all those gags, you know, to the girls and say this, that, and that. And they got away with murder, and what could we offer them, you know? Span. That's about it.
Also, because the army authorities in the States knew that basically the American public were not happy with their men being over here. So the American troops had a lot of facilities over here to keep them happy. Dancers were put on at their base, and British girls were vetted usually and shipped in by bus. Well, you didn't want unsuitable types.
Well, the Americans soon became very popular figures in the ballrooms of Blackpool. They soon became magnets for the English girls, not always to the pleasure of local lads, and particularly after 1 or 2 letters appeared in the local newspaper, thanking local ladies for being kind enough to receive them and dance with them. And when these newspapers were posted to British servicemen abroad, they weren't always too impressed.
The Germans tried to stir up trouble between the Allies by dropping propaganda leaflets down onto the British army in Italy. These leaflets showed a topless British girl embracing a GI, and she was saying, "Oh, you Americans are so different."
The Americans had great uniforms. Gabardine uniforms were made of.
People generally thought that the American GI's uniforms were a lot smarter, a bit flashier than the British counterparts. So they really were seen as the sort of epitome of the war hero at this time.
The Americans looked so modern and so smart when they came over. If you compare a British Tommy in his khaki and an American, you know, one looks at the future and the other one looks, you know, muddy.
Along with their exotic luxuries, the GIs brought exciting moves to our dance floor. They launched a craze for a totally new type of dance. The Lindy Hop was a form of jive developed by the black dance halls in Harlem. When it became a hit with the white folks too, they renamed it the Jitterbug. Woohoo!
I think Jitterbug was intrinsically linked with the big band sound. The dancers fed from the musicians fed from the dancers, and it could be pure joy and frenzy and music and dance and getting totally lost in the moment.
Dug the jitterbug, just a silly lug. It ain't no shame, he's not to blame, he's dug the jitterbug.
The women sometimes showed their underwear, so you felt, you know, a bit naughty, really.
The jitterbug was seen as decidedly un-British and was even banned in some dance halls.
There were some posters up sometimes in halls saying no jitterbugging.
Why wasn't jitterbugging allowed?
The ballroom would be that busy, and when they're jitterbugging, they kick their legs up, and the tower authorities thought that was dangerous because the floor was that full of people dancing, yeah.
How do you actually stop somebody from jitterbugging?
Well, it did happen, especially in the corners if there was no attendants near, but then the attendants would walk round and stop them, and as soon as the attendants went away, it all started up again. Well, it's mostly Americans that did it, yeah.
Another letter to the Evening Gazette asked, "Is it not possible for the managers of ballrooms in Blackpool to come to some arrangement just for 1 or 2 nights for couples to dance the jitterbug?"
1 or 2 jive numbers, OK, but a full evening session, never.
It ain't no shame, he's not to blame. He's Doug, the jitterbug.
Amid the jollity, though, the war continued to claim its victims from the big band world. 1944 brought the news that the great Glenn Miller was missing, presumed dead.
Glenn had left Britain for Paris, where he was due to entertain the troops who had liberated the city. But his plane went missing, and the exact details of what happened remains a mystery to this day.
My Uncle Glenn was a prolific letter writer, and one of the last ones he ever wrote was to my father. And it says, "Take good care of Mother. By the time you get this, I'll be in Paris making billeting for the band, barring a nosedive into the Channel." Now that was prophetic.
The British loved their American big bands, not least vibraphone player Lionel Hampton.
It fascinated me that somebody could get that music out of that instrument. It still fascinates me.
He was a bit too difficult for me to follow, I must be honest, because he was a lunatic at these vibes.
Lionel Hampton is someone who's a vital component in the history of music, really, because he's got a foot in the big bands, but he's also the vital link to rock and roll.
Charlie Watts told me that he went to see him at the Hammersmith Apollo, and it was so exciting. It was like a rock and roll gig because the whole balcony upstairs was going boom, 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 boom. And there's a lot of smoke. I'm not sure what sort of smoke it was, but the whole place was like this. You know, some people thought he was an insensitive yob, the way he played, and that's what I loved best about him. You know. Lionel Hampton started out his career as a drummer and first played the vibraphone with perhaps one of the greatest stars of all time, the great Louis Armstrong.
You take someone like Louis Armstrong, who transcends all genres and types of music because he is a genre on his own. And whether he's reading out the phone book, the shopping list, or any song, you know it's him immediately. And even if it's something like Zippity Doo-Dah, which he recorded, he makes it sound like this incredible work of art because of his vocal style, his time, his trumpet playing. He was a complete one-off, and you can spend all day studying him. Never, ever, ever going to sound like him.
Louis Armstrong is not only a great iconic person because people know him from his films and his records and everything, but as a musician and an artist, he's actually one of the greatest of all time.
Oh, when you smiling, when you smiling.
The more I look at his life and the more I talk to people who really know about music, the more you look at his sound, the more things you find. And you find more of him doing a version of a song, and you go, wow, I never liked that song until he did it, and he brings you to songs.
You got to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative and latch on to the affirmative, but don't mess with Mr. In Between. You got to spread joy up to the maximum and bring gloom down to the minimum. And have faith, or pandemonium's liable to walk upon the scene. To illustrate my last remark, Jonah in the whale, Noah in the ark. What did they do just when everything looked so dark? Man, they said you got to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative and latch on to the affirmative, but don't mess with Mr. In Between.
5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory over Germany.
Finally, on the 7th of May 1945, VE Day arrived, marking victory in Europe. London was packed with ecstatic crowds. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth appeared 8 times on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, while their daughters, the Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret Rose, mingled with the crowds below. The entire nation celebrated. There were fancy dress parades for children, gallons of beer for everybody else, and there was singing and dancing in the streets.
Blue skies smiling at me. Nothing but blue skies. Do I see?
British people were given 2 days off. I mean, that day wouldn't be Day, and then the day after was a sort of public holiday. And the pubs on VE Day ran dry by 8 o'clock in the evening. But nevertheless, there was a great deal of rejoicing and celebrating, and bonfires. There was a bonfire even in Piccadilly, burning effigies of Hitler, hanging effigies of Hitler from lampposts.
London certainly had as much right as anywhere to celebrate victory, and London certainly did.
It was the celebration of the century, and the music people wanted to dance to was the big band.
I went along to Buckingham Palace, where there was an enormous throng already assembled all around the Victoria Memorial. So I got the trumpet out and I started to play, and people made a circle and started to dance, and musicians appeared out of the blue. There was a trombone player turned up, and a sailor who had what looked like the horn of one of those enormous old-fashioned gramophones, into which he sort of blew raspberries, and it made a sort of tuba sound. And there were various sort of people with percussion things, and so we got a small band together.
My nan's piano was pushed into the street, where she treated the neighbours to some lovely music hall songs. And here in Blackpool, the town came to a virtual standstill. The Tower Ballroom was jammed with revellers ready to dance all night.
After the war, Blackpool returns to being what it's always been, a place for fun.
Churchill had saved Britain in its hour of need. But the population were hungry for change. He and his Conservative government were voted out at the next election.
I'm a little on the lonely, a little on the lonely side.
Labour will now have a majority over all parties in a House of 640.
Meanwhile, the thousands of American servicemen based in Britain were going back home. Some had formed romances in the ballrooms and took our womenfolk away with them. Others returned empty-handed.
But Britain was broken too. The cities were in ruins, and we were deeply in debt to America. The men who survived the war came home to unemployment and uncertainty.
There continued to be tremendous shortages. Rationing continued until 1954. The winter after the war was absolutely bitter. People were really, really cold. There was still a shortage of petrol, a shortage of coal.
But in Blackpool, things were a bit different. They blatantly ignored the austerity. They weren't going to let a little thing like sugar rationing get in the way of producing their signature sweet.
With me little stick of Blackpool rock, along the promenade I stroll.
The black market was huge, and many rock workers' families didn't go hungry. The authorities tried in vain to stop the practice. But they didn't succeed until the end of sugar rationing, when long queues were reported in the resort sweet shops as people stocked up on the now legitimate Blackpool rock.
After the war, Blackpool benefited from a steady flow of visitors and a healthy black market in nylons, petrol, sausages, innuendo and Blackpool rock. But it was not until 1949 that the illuminations shone again.
The music of wartime meant so much to so many people that the public still demanded this music to dance to. But the days of the big band were numbered. Ted Heath captured this nostalgic feeling and led the way in Britain's post-war big band era. He recorded more than 100 albums, which sold over 20 million copies. Like many of his contemporaries, Ted Heath started out in the big band boom of the 20s, playing in London's famous Kit Kat Club. Then, the success of Glenn Miller during the war led Ted to formulate his own version of the smooth swing sound.
Glenn was impressed with Ted Heath, and he said to Ted, "You really got something." He said, "When I get back from the continent," he says, "I'll give you a dozen arrangements to get you started." Well, he obviously didn't do that, but on the strength of that statement, Ted and Moira started their own band, and the rest is history. I'm a massive, massive fan of Ted Heath.
Well, Ted Heath was a very nice, gentle man, you know, conducting this not very gentle kind of band. You know, they were very, very energetic and playing some very complicated arrangements.
He did it right, Ted. He understood the business. He understood how to handle a band. He had great ideas. He had great arrangers. And we used to know the names of all the band at one time, and I can't remember them now. But they were as admired and adored as someone like, I suppose, One Direction and things like that are at the moment.
The man who lives next door to me is rich as rich can be.
Petula Clark went from Force's sweetheart to film star, often singing with British big band leaders Geraldo and Ted Heath.
Miser, miser, counting gold. What you gonna do when you grow old? Miser, miser, kids all say that old man will give a dime away. Miser, miser, you're getting worse. Now shake all the mucks from out of your purse. Miser, miser, take a chance. Spend a few coppers on a romance.
My first experience of that kind of music was singing with Ted. Yeah, it was great.
Meanwhile, in the big band's homeland of America, their popularity was going into decline. Even Duke Ellington had to downsize and use his recording royalties to subsidise the running costs of his band.
Of course, there are many, many places around the world where you can take a trio or quartet and, you know, you can work for 2 or 3 weeks because they're little places and there isn't a big overhead, and so it's easy, you know. But with these guys, and I have so many expensive people in the band, and, you know, it's the highest paid band in the world. I mean, they get the money, I get the kicks.
Whilst big bands were declining in America, many successful singers like Frank Sinatra toured in Britain and started booking British big bands to perform with them.
It doesn't move me at
In
all.
the early 1950s, sales of American records dominated the British charts. When Frank Sinatra came to Britain, he was the highest ever paid performer with an enormous fee of 2,000 quid a show. And one of the few places he played in Britain was right here at the Blackpool Opera House.
Saturday night is the loneliest night of the week. I sing the song that I sang for the memories I usually see.
Frank Sinatra had emerged from the Tommy Dorsey Big Band and went on to be one of the best-selling artists of all time. I'm taking a drive with the man who was chauffeur to the stars back in the heyday of the big bands in Blackpool. When were you first aware of big bands, Frank?
Big bands, all from 1940. Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey, all the other big bands.
What, the records or the actual people?
No, no people. We got the music.
78.
You're going back a long way. Well, there were no CDs in those days, no.
Yeah.
It was vinyl records.
So people loved the big band music, but the Americans then, they didn't really, the big American big band stars didn't really come here, is that right?
No. Ted Heath was one of the biggest bands that came. Ambrose, Geraldo. They came to the Winter Gardens and played for summer season.
So you had one very special American artist come and join you, didn't you?
I did indeed, Jules, yes. It's Frank Sinatra.
Come fly with me, let's fly away.
He came in 1950 and he came in 1953. He came twice to Blackpool. I drove him twice. His reputation had gone down slightly in America, but when he saw the people jumping on the Buick, banging on the windows, he just said, "They love me in this town, don't they?" I said, "Yes, they do, sir." He said, "I could become mayor." I said, "Well, yes, you could." But it was good. He talked to me all the time.
And what sort of thing did he say to you?
Well, we mentioned about Blackpool Promenade. We're just on the promenade at the moment. We mentioned about the Blackpool illuminations, and he said, yes, he was amazed at that. All the street lights lit up.
It's my kind of town.
Frank, were there lots of girls waiting for
yes.
Mr. Sinatra?
Lots of girls waiting outside. There were, yes. One in particular. Frank came out. I opened the limo door. He was getting in. He just turned round. He caught somebody in his eye. He said, "Are you waiting for me, honey?" And she said, "No, I'm waiting for the driver." Oh. It was my missus.
Oh.
She's the right girl for me.
What was the atmosphere like when the big bands were playing? I mean, in the war and that. What was it like here in the war?
Oh, they're terrific. Blackpool was going like a bomb. They thought everything in Blackpool was going to stop, but we had the RAF part here. Every hotel in Bradley Street, Albert Road, were all RAF personnel. And the town was booming. It was great. And there were bands coming, dances every night, everywhere. It was great.
Do you think people were living a bit like there was no tomorrow?
Well, yes.
Well, they might not have
That
been.
was it. The war was on, 1940, Battle of Britain. Oh, yes, we knew it. Liverpool got bombed. We got bombed in Blackpool.
Well, I must say it's great being up here driving you around, because it's an honour to drive you, because you've driven so many of the great people.
Well, thank you, Jules, very much. It's the first time I've been driven a limousine, Jules, and you're doing very well indeed. I must congratulate you on
Well,
that.
thanks very much. That's high praise from the guru.
That long, long road.
In 1952, the Queen came to the throne. After the years of post-war austerity, the new reign seemed to mark the beginning of an age of hope.
Forget your troubles and just get happy. You better chase all your cares away.
With the booming of the economy, Brits had more paid holiday time than ever before, and fond wartime memories of Blackpool kept bringing them back. In the 1950s, up to 17 million visitors a year were coming here.
Blackpool, known to millions of Britons and millions from overseas.
Hundreds of special trains bring thousands of people daily to this mecca of pleasure. Not such a good harvest this year. To weigh up any situation, there are always the scales. She's eager to know the result. Couldn't possibly tell you what she said.
The 50s were a time of massive immigration into the UK. There was an influx of musicians from the Caribbean, and in London, new jazz clubs started to open up, including Ronnie Scott's.
The big bands had become expensive, and music was becoming more diverse. Skiffle, ska, modern and traditional jazz all had a following, and boogie-woogie had transmorphed into rock and roll.
But the big bands weren't dead. In the early 50s, they provided the backing for scores of top singers. It was only when rock and roll took the country by storm that the big bands finally bowed out. But for those who'd lived through the war years, there was really only one kind of music.
I think that the golden age of the big band had more glamour and excitement than any other music in history. The joy the big band sound brought to the British in their darkest hour still resonates today.
I'll be singing you in all the old familiar places that my heart embraces.